an advanced race in a distant planetary system, sometime in the remote future. Imagine that they are dedicated to chronicling the activities of all known civilizations throughout the galaxy. Imagine that all they know of the Cybermen is restricted to 10 Earth documents that have somehow come their way. What you're about to hear is the work of archivist Hegalia. What you're about to hear has been accessed from the files of the Cyber Hive, one of a vast arc of hives drifting in space. These archives are intended by the unnamed race to increase knowledge and understanding of the galaxy and of the ways of what they term absolute necessity.
The past derives its power to illuminate the present through its infinite mystery. No one will therefore be so foolish as to suppose that a definitive answer is either attainable or desirable. But we must be courageous enough always to believe that an answer is not impossible. Kid Vista, Archive founder.
To buy British tanks, they would have announced it by now, but they're waiting for Christmas. They always do this. They wait for the reason. Over the government than what industrialists in Leeds or trade unionists or people like that have. This is that.
How you?
These tanks are better
Archive. A History of the Cyber Race by archivist Hegalia. What we know of the Cybermen is limited almost entirely to the evidence of the 9 audio-visual documents, or cyber documents, which have found their way to us from Earth. But it is enough. Among the Ark's accounts of intelligent life throughout the known universe, Cybermen are infamous. It is fortunate for us, who are sometimes called the archivists of the galaxy, that we have never experienced at first hand the ruthless logic of the cyber race. It is our endeavor, we who are privileged to visit the great archives, to spread knowledge of those who are like us and greater understanding of those who are not like us. If absolute necessity has gently compelled us to use the undoubted gifts of our race in this way, it has also preserved us from the ravages under which mightier civilizations have foundered. Who more able than the archivists to appreciate this truth? Who better placed than we to know that if ever the shadow of the Cybermen were to fall on our civilization, a new dark age of ignorance and brutality might extend throughout the galaxy? I have tried to come to some kind of satisfying, credible conclusion about cyber origins and the way the documents might fit into a cyber chronology. The emphasis must always be on that might. We are given few unequivocal facts in the documents, and even some of these must be considered carefully. the Archive founder cautions us against the folly of seeking definitive answers. I have tried to find one of the possible answers. And then, whenever I began to feel, quite logically of course, that my idea was best, I would recall the doctor's excellent advice.
Logic, my dear Zoe, merely enables one to be wrong with authority.
Origins of the Cybermen. 15 billion years ago, the universe was born. It started with a bang. A single point had once contained everything. Suddenly it exploded. Matter spread outwards, filling the void evenly and thinly. Space-time began. The untamed power of the universe at last took stock of itself. Expansion slowed. Matter became less evenly spread. Billowing cosmic dust condensed into whirling constellations of suns and planets. There was a cooling, a consolidation into galaxies. 10 billion years elapsed. An aging sun at the edge of a certain galaxy expired in an explosion outshining 10 billion stars. Cosmic cloud was compressed by the supernova, and new suns were born. One of them was Sol. As Sol became a bright yellow star, it was surrounded by a disk of icy dust whose radius was 40 billion miles. Up to 30 million miles away from Sol, the ices melted, and only rocky grains remained. The grains clumped together as they swept round the sun until the bodies of the planets were formed. The larger the core, the denser the atmosphere which the planet attracted from the all-pervasive gases of hydrogen and helium. Sol was so named by a species of intelligent creatures who evolved 5 billion years later. They inhabited a planet named Earth. Earth was watery, a warm and fertile place, one of the inner rocky planets, a mere 93 million miles away from Sol. It shared its orbit around the Sun with an almost identical planet, twinned from the same condensing matter, bearing the same life-producing elements, sharing the same climatic conditions. The twin was called Mondas. These two gems of Sol's system encircled their Sun, encircling each other in the characteristic dance of double planets. Each, in time, produced sentient humans, Homo sapiens, who became aware of some of the larger and nearer planets in the Sun system to which they belonged. Earth, for most of its history, believed itself to be the center of a whirling universe. Mondas did not share this delusion for long. The unending quest for a scientific base for belief, characteristic of their later civilization, started early and was single-mindedly pursued. Earth's progress was less consistent. Much was learned, and as much forgotten in the waxing and waning of successive civilizations, in the scrabble for bare existence. Though born as twins, while Mondas grew apace, Earth dawdled. The cosmological origins of the Cybermen are the least difficult to surmise. They are based on the assumptions about our own beginnings and those of many intelligent life forms documented in the Ark. From now on, our suppositions become more hazardous. For us, the prehistoric period is really the pre-documentary period and is virtually impenetrable. Apart from a few tantalizing clues, we must freely admit that we know nothing of this period. But having made our ignorance quite clear, there is nothing to stop us from picking up those few poor clues and juggling. One such a clue is this. Mondas was another name for Earth in one of the ancient languages. Dr. Barclay remembers this in document 3, and it is confirmed by the Cybermen. What can we make of it? Undoubtedly, the humans of Mondas must have developed more quickly than those of Earth. Navaza suggests that Mondasian civilization might already have been so well advanced that even at such an early stage of development, when Earth was at the hunter-gatherer stage, it had perfected some rudimentary form of inter-orbit travel in order to be able to visit its twin. Certainly there are copious references in ancient Earth texts to support the idea of visitation from another world. In many instances, these visitors would seem to have looked like the Earth people, but displayed great knowledge and more advanced intelligence. When giants walked the Earth is a form of an idea recurring in many early writings. It may refer to the larger-than-Earth-life characteristics of knowledge and stature presented by such a comparatively advanced race. It is known that ancient Earth communities were able to perfect techniques for traveling immense distances over their largely water-covered planet, visiting continents that were not to be discovered until several millennia later by more advanced civilizations. Perhaps, then, Navaza's postulation is not to be ruled out, and Mondasians did hop across to their twin planet thousands of years before they developed proper space travel. Presumably there would have been opportunity for racial mixing. Moreover, ancient records suggest that selected Earth people were taken up to Mondas. Such cross-fertilization might have resulted in a very similar genetic stock of Homo sapiens on both planets. With the similarities of orbit, planet size, land masses, climate, and evolutionary development, Mondas and Earth would thus have been true twins. As the Cyberman in Document 3 makes quite clear,
we were exactly like you once.
At some indeterminate time, a cosmological event occurred of fundamental significance to the future existence of Mondas. The planet left the orbit it had shared with its twin. When and how this occurred is a point that becomes clearer through careful attention to the documents. Some archivists have assumed that Mondas, driven by its own propulsion unit, left Earth orbit millions of years ago. But what are we told? All we know about Mondas leaving its original orbit is based on two passages from Document 3. The Doctor says,
"You see, millions of years ago, there was a twin planet to Earth."
He is interrupted before he can say more. And a Cyberman says,
Eons ago, the planets were twins. Then we drifted away from you on a journey to the edge of space. Now we have returned.
There is nothing more precise here than that Mondas and Earth shared a cosmological development some immeasurable length of time in the past. It was at an unspecified period after this that Mondas actually left its orbit. As we shall see, it makes a great deal of sense to place this departure no more than 10 or 20,000 years before the return. Furthermore, the Cyberman says that they drifted away from Earth. This does not sound like a premeditated act under their own control, more like the result of the cosmological event Navaza postulates, and with which I concur. The propulsion unit is mentioned only in Document 2. Griffiths asks,
I mean, how can a planet travel around off its orbit?
to which the Doctor replies,
Mondas had a propulsion unit, tribute to cyber engineering. Though why they should want to push a planet through space, I've no idea.
The Doctor is certainly confirming that Cybermen did have control over their planet when it returned to attack Earth. He does not indicate when the propulsion unit was first developed. For the passages not to contradict, the only sense they make is the conclusion Navaza comes to. Mondas drifted helplessly to the far reaches of the solar system, 40 billion miles out where the cometary cloud thins to nothing,
The edge of space.
made such technological advances during the thousands of years of that journey to perfect a way of controlling their direction and speed of travel, and so returned to their original place in the cosmos. To imagine the Mondasians might have been able to propel their planet out of fixed orbit millions of years before Homo sapiens have evolved on Earth is impossible if we are to accept some kind of parity of development between what are meant to be twin planets. Moreover, if Mondas had perfected such amazing technology as to be able to leave the solar system at a time that the dinosaurs, say, still roamed Earth, then it is inconceivable that 70 million years on, Mondasians would merely have reached the stage of the relatively primitive Cybermen. After all that time, they are more likely to have become creatures invisible to Earth perceptions. There are records of such species in the Ark, and see Mandragora helix, rather than a race of metal and plastic which must be provided with a suitable radio link to invade Earth, which succumbs to radiation, gravity, and gold, see documents 3, 5, and 7, and which cannot fathom the laws of time. Since we have already seen the marked technological progress they make within some 600 years, between documents 1 and 2, they would have to be the latest starters in the universe. It is more plausible, I think, to set the departure of Mondas sometime in the period after Homo sapiens had become well established on Earth. That is, less than 40,000 years before the return of Mondas. There is not the space here for the elaboration of the many different cosmic phenomena that could have taken Mondas away from Earth. For that, Navaz's hyper-historical postulates provides ample technical discussion. Only 2 issues need to be raised. Firstly, the Ark hives are amply supplied with similar accounts of the transmutation of whole civilizations, whose catalyst was a cosmological event, a star going nova, a particularly intense bombardment of meteors. The events to be related in Document 4 will suggest that the Cybermen had a fundamental understanding of the significance of such phenomena. The more plausible of such phenomena are those which might have resulted in a slow drifting away from Sol, during which the Mondasians could adapt to changing climatic conditions. Interestingly, during the period of the documents, it was known that the Moon was slowly moving away from Earth, though only at a rate of a few meters per century. Mondasians could have survived a departure 1,000,000 times faster. But here we come to another possible cause of the planet's displacement: the arrival of the Moon to become Earth's satellite. It is this possibility which introduces the second and more important issue, what Farazia has called her 14-planet theory. We know that at some stage, Cybermen colonized a planet called Telos. The 14-planet theory starts with the common assumption that Telos cannot belong to Sol's planetary system, an assumption with which Farazia concurs, given the planet's conditions: sky, cloudy and bluish, atmosphere, rarefied but breathable by humans, environment capable of evolving and supporting a humanoid species, albeit at sub-zero temperatures. If it were in the solar system, it would have to be one of the inner planets, and there is none to fit that description. Telos is also usually thought to have been colonized as Mondas passed by on its journey. But here is a difficulty. Even if we were to accept that Mondas was propelled by some device, the time it would take to drive a planet through deepest space and visit at least one other planetary system would be immense. Traveling at 100,000 miles an hour, it would take 30,000 years to reach the nearest system. Then we have to assume the existence of a suitable planet within the system, as well as a return journey of 30,000 years duration. The next nearest star system is twice the distance of the first, and would therefore take 60,000 years to reach, 120,000 for the round trip. We are asked, in the conventional view, to accept that such a marathon was undertaken, and before the planet's resources were entirely drained. But what would be the meaning of journey to the edge of space in this context? Furthermore, the passage of even these periods of time stretches credulity to breaking point. If, 60,000 years previously, the Mondasians were capable of such technological feats as to build planet-propelling units, how advanced would their civilization have become by their return? The idea that Mondas colonized Telos as it passed on its journey begins to appear untenable. It is confirmed as such by the following consideration. Mondasian Cybermen were dependent on energy beamed from Mondas, and, as Document 3 clearly shows, when their planet was destroyed, it was inevitably the end of them, too. But Document 9 has the Doctor saying,
If Mondas hadn't been destroyed, the Cybermen would never have come here.
To Telos. We must infer that the colonization of Telos took place after the destruction of Mondas, but by Cybermen who had become independent of their home planet while it was still on its journey. Cybermen who nevertheless regarded Mondas as their home planet to be rejoined when Mondas had made its return to plunder Earth. The failure of the Mondasian plan left these independent Cybermen dispossessed and led them, finally, to discover Telos. But who were these independent Cybermen? If Mondas had developed sophisticated space-traveling skills to take exploring Cybermen to other systems, or even galaxies, those Cybermen would have discovered planets of their own to colonize, relinquishing any contact with Mondas. The destruction of Mondas would not trigger the desperate search to adopt another suitable planet that is suggested by Document 9. Additionally, is it not likely that Mondas would have surreptitiously sent an advance invasion fleet to conquer Earth before bringing in a huge planet to attack it? Of course, one might consider the Cybermen of the first invasion to be exactly that, sent from Mondas to prepare the way. But those Cybermen differ so markedly between Document 1 and Document 3. What is more, neither group makes reference to the other, and what little is revealed of the first invasion Cybermen implies that they come from what they call Planet 14. Farazia's solution is to look for a possible temporary home for the Cybermen within the solar system, a Planet 14, in fact. The solar system does not only consist of the Sun and the 9 planets in the way that popular Earth conception imagined at the time of Document 3. It is, of course, more complex and extensive. There is, for example, the asteroid belt, which was thought by many Earth cosmologists, and we have corroborative evidence in Image of the Fendal, to be the remains of an ancient planet. Farazia refers to it as Asteris. Ironically, just before the return of Mondas, these cosmologists were engaged in a feverish observation of the skies to find Planet 10, not Mondas, but a body beyond Pluto, and thus explain the perturbed orbits of the outer planets. The notion also that the solar system is divided into the smaller, solid inner planets and the giant, gaseous outer planets is a simplification. Pluto is a small, solid body, as are many of the moons of the gaseous giants, some of which are larger than Pluto itself. It has its own moon, Charon, which is so relatively large that together they might be described as double planets. The cosmologists estimated Planet 10 itself to be 4 times as heavy as Earth, a dwarf compared to the giant planets of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. By 20th century Earth assumptions, then, the solar system could be said to have contained, with Mondas, Asteris, and Planet 10, 12 planets. If one includes the cometary cloud of rock and ice which constantly orbits the Sun and which originates many of the comets, the solar system extends to a distance of about 1.5 light years, or 40 billion miles from the Sun. Pluto is just over 3.5 billion miles from Sol. Beyond Pluto and Planet 10, the expanse which remains under solar influence could easily contain at least one more substantial body that may be called a planet. But this would only account for 13 planets. And where does the Moon fit into all this? The origin of the Moon puzzled Earth cosmologists. Moon rock is too dissimilar from Earth rock for the two planets to have formed together in space. One theory was that the Moon had formed in a different part of the solar system and was later captured by Earth's gravitational influence. If this was the case, then as far as Mondas was concerned, the Moon was a planet in its own right, a 14th planet in the solar system by what might have been ancient Mondasian reckoning. Farazier uses this idea to suggest how Mondas might have been moved from its orbit. She then goes on to weave it into her larger 14-planet theory. In Hypotheses, she writes,
Mondas and Earth were a double planet. They orbited round each other as they moved together round Sol. 3.5 billion miles away, there was another double planet, Pluto and Charon. Significantly, in composition and size, the Moon is almost indistinguishable from Mercury, suggesting that they had similar origins. What if they were formed together, were once a third double planet within the solar system? Let us suppose that this must have been the case. At some stage, the Moon must have been dislodged from its orbit with Mercury to close in on Earth and Mondas. It was this event, I suggest, that pulled Mondas away from Earth on a slow but inexorable journey towards the edge of the solar system. The path Mondas took was anything but direct, first spiraling slowly outwards, allowing Mondasians sufficient centuries to adapt to the worsening conditions on their planet, then zigzagging across the solar system as it came under the gravitational influences of other planets it passed on its way. In this bizarre manner, the journey to the edge of space might have lasted thousands of Earth years.
Her 14-planet theory is pure supposition. Nevertheless, given that we must surmise so much, I think such postulates are permissible, provided always that they are consistent with the facts. Farazier's theory is. A totally literal approach equips us with the bare bones. Mondas drifting away from Sol, somehow sending out a deep space invasion fleet before itself returning to Earth under its own propulsion. It needs imaginative detail to put flesh on the bone, a hypothetical exoskeleton, if you like, within which inconsistencies, radical changes in cyber appearance, and points of vagueness, Planet 14, may be fitted. What follows is my attempt to put flesh on the bones, a detailed reconstruction of the undocumented period after Mondas left its orbit, a period all the more tantalizing for its transition from Mondasian to Cyberman. The reconstruction is firmly based on clues found in the documents and on the 14-planet theory. Journey to the edge of space. The Mondasians had rapidly to adapt to the severe changes that followed from moving away from their sun. The initial and most dramatic changes were those affecting the climate. The weather immediately ceased to follow age-old patterns. Storms, earthquakes, tidal waves, drought covered the planet in chaotic profusion. Temperatures dropped, and increasingly bitter winters followed, one hard upon the other, until after several centuries, the entire Mondasian year was an endless, icy season. To survive these climatic traumas, it is most likely that the Mondasians went to ground. First, utilizing natural underground chambers, they must gradually have perfected techniques for excavating immense subterranean living areas where life could continue almost as before. Learning to tap the vast supplies of energy available from the core of molten rock and metal deep within the planet, they found it possible to resume some kind of dignified existence. But it was not the life they knew. Only after the deepest of dark ages, perhaps thousands of years long, could they set about rediscovering their old technological prowess. Once they have achieved a kind of stability within their new, artificially created environment, had enjoyed perhaps a golden millennium of progress and comfort as underground dwellers, they could no longer ignore the deeper implications of their predicament. Mondas was on an immense, eccentric orbit that would take it way beyond the last planet in the solar system. On the calculation of their scientists, the Mondasians knew that the rate of drift from Sol would then gradually decrease until the turning point, the zenith of their orbit, was reached. Then, Mondas would inexorably begin its return journey towards the sun. That much was clear. What was also clear was that as Mondas moved further and further away from life-giving Sol, the whole Mondasian race would gradually weaken and eventually die out. To understand the manner in which the Mondasians responded to the knowledge of that future, it is necessary to consider for a moment their cultural background. The culture of logic. Mondas had for long been a technocratic society, a society whose resources were organized and managed by technical experts for the good of all. Uninterrupted ages of scientific prowess had led to the rapid advancement of their world, whereas its twin experienced a painfully slow rise in the level of global wealth, with one civilization coming to prominence, vying with another, and collapsing. Mondas made steadier progress. It was able, through consistent technological progress, to minimize the worst excesses of poverty and deprivation, and create a united world community, while Earth still floundered, as it were, in the mud of the tribal battlefield. Mondas, thus far in its history, parallels the development of several of the highly sophisticated planetary civilizations with which any visitor to the archives will be familiar. At this stage of development, the pursuit of logic as an overriding ideology can easily become established. Logic is the essence of scientific discipline, and as such can come to be thought of not just as a useful means to an end, but the end in itself. This important developmental stage has been neatly termed the ideological phase, ILP. A note here about Earth's ideological phase. Earth seems almost to have reached ILP by the middle of its third millennium AD. A school of thought, embodied by the Brotherhood of Logicians, had become particularly influential at this time, Document 6. Even earlier, in the 21st century, Document 4, the Doctor's companion, Zoe, had gone through a rigorous educational process, some called it brainwashing, in the school of parapsychology. It taught that logic led infallibly to truth. Many advanced civilizations emerge from ILP, having reaffirmed that logic must be tempered by less easily defined disciplines, compassion, and notions of the subtle interconnectedness of all things. The logic-compassion equation usually becomes recognized as the absolute necessity. We, the archivists, have for long had a deep-rooted understanding of the LC equation. The archives and the untiring pursuit of knowledge they represent demonstrate our dedication to the understanding. It is to be hoped that Earth itself, should it yet remain, has now approached some semblance of it. It would seem that the ideological phase was well underway on Mondas when it was assailed by the great cosmological catastrophe that skewed its future irrevocably. Because of the need to survive in the face of potential long-term extinction, they applied pure logic and construed their position thus. Fact 1. Mondas is a planet which will cease to support life. Fact 2. Survival is a logical priority, the justification of existence. Fact 3. Mondasians are technologically adept. Fact 4. The extent to which environment can be adapted, subterranean exploitation, has reached its limit. Conclusion. Technological effort should be directed towards altering body and mind. That is, Mondasians must adapt themselves in order to survive. The logic was impeccable. By technocratic consent, all the resources of Mondas would be organized and managed to this end, utilizing the vast expertise of the planet's many technicians for the logical good of Mondasian society as a whole. The logical imperative to be placed above all other was survival of the race. So, as their planet drifted away from Sol, as generation upon generation of Mondasians became more frail and sickly, as their lifespan shortened, the science of cybernetics was developed and perfected. As limbs became useless, they were replaced by superbly efficient mechanical ones. As organs gave out, artificial substitutes were inserted which potentially could last forever. As the race, like the planet itself, became increasingly barren and fewer children were born, the quest for immortality assumed a major importance. Mondasians who underwent continuous cyberneticization discovered they had attained a form of immortal life. But while growing numbers of Mondasians, both female and male, were thus gaining a kind of immortality, they were simultaneously giving up much of their individuality and humanity. Advances in neurological cybernetics led to the adjustment of the brain to enable it to cope with the increasing demand for a ruthlessly logical point of view. The ganglia of instinctual responses, evolved during pre-human development, were hopelessly raveled up with the more recent but illogical emotions. Both instinct and emotion were gradually excised from the brain. They were redundant to the pursuit of pure logic. In their place were substituted artificial neuron modules of cybernetic procedures. These encouraged actions which would ensure the survival of the race. Self-fulfillment became inseparable from race fulfillment. Increasingly sterile, and with fewer and fewer emotions to appreciate the delights of the senses, the Mondasians deemed the sexual instinct to be inappropriate, and quite simply removed it. As sexless immortals intent on survival, the feminine aspects in both male and female became less valued, the masculine aspects reinforced and caricatured. Thus were the Cybermen born. It was a slow birth, The full transformation of the Mondasians from animal organisms, as their cyber descendants were to classify them, into mechanized animates, as Navaza terms the Cybermen, will have taken place over several thousand years. To the original human Mondasians, the first replacements of living matter by mechanical parts must have been a heady and revolutionary step. When we climb a mountain, there are many points when we think the summit is near and we can go no further. But as we reach the peak, there are yet more peaks ahead, other summits to scale, and our resolve to reach the top, because it is there, takes us up and onward. So it must have been with the Mondasians. Each tampering with the human form seemed to be at the edge of the possible. Yet from the vantage of that edge, there always appeared ways of continuing the assault. Progress may have felt slow and uncertain, but with each glance back, the heights they had reached astounded and exhilarated them, and they pressed forward with new perspective and fresh determination. Farazia suggests that Mondas was nearing the edge of the solar system by the time the potential of cyberneticization had been discovered, but before a widespread program had been formally instituted. Understandably, there would have been considerable dissension from the idea of complete conversion for all Mondasians. But equally, she conjectures, there were those on Mondas, the hardliners, who believed that total cyberneticization must be pursued speedily as an end in itself. To retain any vestige of humanity was no longer of logical value. The faction, as Farazia terms these hardliners, would certainly have been in the minority. But they were fired by that blazing conviction which so often underlies the seemingly cold ideals for which logic alone is meant to have paved the way. Naturally, the majority of Mondasians wished only to take such cybernetic measures as would ensure the survival of the race until the inevitable return to Sol. Of central importance was the moment Mondas came close to the old orbit, which it has shared with Earth. By that time, Mondasian technology might have advanced to the point where the planet could be stabilized into the original position. The faction, however, was not prepared to relinquish their strongly held beliefs. Any notion that Mondasians could retain more than a dim memory of their former humanity during the long ages of exile was illogical and reeked of nostalgic self-delusion. What had to be embraced wholeheartedly was the realization that neither Mondas nor its inhabitants would ever be the same again. The way of humanity was behind them now. There was no going back. There was also a more pressing consideration which complicated the problem. The planet's energy reserves were not unlimited. It was doubtful whether they would be sufficient to support the surviving Mondasians for the rest of their journey without great austerity and much hardship. Additional energy would be also required to develop the technology for planetary propulsion as well as to power the drive. For Mondasians, the next few thousand years would be an unremitting age of wretched waiting, torn between hope and fear. The faction saw a way in which Mondas could be powerful again, master of its own fate and exultant in its technological prowess. Cyberneticization must be pursued to its logical end, by which time an indestructible, immortal, fearless race would have taken the place of the faltering Mondasians. Such a race would need no special kind of environment to support it. They had lost the ability to produce offspring, but this new race would propagate through the conquering and conversion of other planets. Unlike the majority, for whom it was a means to an end, survival would be an end in itself, the reason for existence. The Mondasian cause was to wait and hope. The cause of the new race was to survive and conquer. The faction wanted to take a bold and fateful step. Mondas was to pass close to a far planet in the solar system, the 14th away from Sol. Planet 14 was cold, dark, and desolate, but it represented for the faction a place where cyberneticization could be pursued without reservation. Resurrecting the ancient technology of earth-hopping, which had lain forgotten and unused since before the Great Catastrophe, a small group of faction adherents, perhaps a few thousand in all, left Mondas forever in a daring leap between worlds. They set up a new type of life. Their sacrifice, their vision, would forge a new race that would lead Mondas to found a mighty empire when at last the planet returned from the edge of space. Mondas drifted on through the cometary cloud. Millennia passed. Despite the departure of the hardliners, a gentle process of cyberneticization continued. Advances were made as physiological and psychological weaknesses gradually manifested themselves. The human form was slow to disappear, yet inexorably a new race of beings was being established on Mondas. What the faction had not flinched from predicting came to be a palpable fact. Old Mondas, planet 4 in the ancient cosmology, once the rich and civilized apotheosis of technocratic humanity, had undergone a space change and was utterly transformed. It was now populated by Cybermen of the subspecies Cybermondasian. Mondas had become a cold, utilitarian culture whose brilliance was solely directed towards survival and return. Also transformed for them was the meaning of return. It would not be, could never be, they gradually realized, a coming back to the old ways of the pure animal organisms they once were. Return would instead be a going forward to a new phase in their development as mechanical animates, an opportunity to reside near the center of a rich planetary system whose resources they could usefully exploit. Planet 5, their former twin, the richest, most temperate planet of the solar system, would provide the greatest scope for exploitation. There was certainly copious mineral wealth to be plundered, but there was plunder more valuable still. Earth teemed with a human populace. Many would be suitable for conversion into Cybermen. The cyber race would burgeon. It was an eminently logical process. To aid and control the return, their technology had been channeled towards one goal: planetary propulsion. That goal had now been reached. The drive could only be used sparingly for fear of draining resources that were fast running out. But it would enable Mondas to take a more direct route towards Earth than the haphazard path they had helplessly followed on the outward journey. A route that could always keep Sol between them and Earth to avoid being detected until the last possible moment. The long-awaited return was underway. Developments on Planet 14. There was no atmosphere on Planet 14. It was too small to hold one. There was mineral wealth of a kind. including the metals and other raw materials necessary to the expanding cyber-technological base the faction saw as central to their plans. But by far the most important feature of the planet was that it was geologically active. It had a molten core which the faction could tap for their energy supplies. The several thousand years of development which followed must have seen technological achievements to rival those of the world they left behind. Both became Cybermen with common roots and a common desire to plunder the riches of Earth. But each was distinct from the other. The faction worked from the same principles of cyberneticization, but because they had a different end in view, they diverged from the Mondasians in appearance and function. Their instincts were more radical. Cyberneticization was to them an end in itself. Humanity was an obsolescence which was to be left behind them. It did not matter to them how mechanical their appearance became. As for human tissue, the less they needed, the better. To survive and conquer was a warlike ethos, demanding a militaristic hierarchy. Cyber-faction became a race whose function identified them: controllers, leaders, lieutenants, technicians, scouts, and troops. Once they were fully consolidated on Planet 14, several millennia after their departure from Mondas, the next logical step was to extend their influence beyond the planet. The obvious first target for conquest and colonization was the next planet in from theirs. Every 500 years, Planet 13 approached its closest point to Planet 14, a distance of some 7 billion miles. It afforded minimal mineral resources, but was a stepping stone towards the greater riches of the other planets. It challenged Cyberfaction to make fresh progress in a long-neglected field of endeavor: space travel. Just as these developments were reaching their peak, an observation of great significance was made by their astronomers. Mondas was on its return journey. Furthermore, it seemed that there was at least one area where Cyber-Mondasian technology had diverged from theirs. Mondas was no longer held within the bounds of its extended orbit, at the mercy of the gravitational influences of every planetary body it passed. The planet now appeared to possess self-propulsion devices, enabling it to make its return earlier than expected. With such technology, Mondas would certainly be able to stabilize into its original orbit, as millennia before had been the Mondasians' great hope. Such a possibility was of fundamental importance to Cyberfaction. Invasion of Earth for its mineral resources and billions of convertible humans had always figured as the pinnacle of cyber conquest. They assumed, logically, that their ancient cousins on Mondas would have evolved similarly enough to seek the same spoils, and resolved that if Cybermen from Planet 14 and from Mondas should join forces, the cyber race would truly prove invincible. Calculating that it would be some decades yet before Mondas reached its destination, Cyberfaction reckoned that there was time enough to build up a huge invasion force to make the unprecedented voyage to Earth. It was just over twice the distance of the journey to the neighboring planet for which they had been preparing. It would take almost a decade with their primitive space technology. They would travel in one massive deep spaceship that would transport within it hundreds of small invasion craft, and itself act as the cyber control center. The venture would drain the resources of their planet. The journey would be strictly one way, but it was a risk which had to be undertaken, a logical necessity. The prize was too great to ignore. Once in possession of Planet 5, Cyberfaction would await the arrival of their ancient world in order to join forces with it and establish the cyber race triumphant throughout the solar system. The slow climb towards global awareness on Earth continued. There was much backsliding, much forgetfulness of the valuable knowledge assimilated by previous ages. But eventually, almost 2 millennia after the coming of a charismatic and influential teacher whose birth was used as the basis of a new calendar, nearly 20 centuries after the year of this Lord, or Anno Domini, AD, the people of Earth were beginning to see themselves as belonging to a community. Phrases such as global village and one world began to be used to describe this potential unity. It was still, however, a potential that had yet to be realized. Since audiovisual communications over the entire world had become rapid and efficient, it was no longer possible to ignore the disastrous implications of intercontinental wars, 2 of which had already raged during the 20th century. Stability was sought and won, but at a price. Methods were developed of bringing about total destruction to entire cities, to whole civilizations, to the world itself. No one dared use these fearful weapons of mass annihilation, yet all lived under the shadow of their threat. Earth became deeply divided into 4 broad blocks. Politically, the East and the West were ranged against each other in what was called a Cold War, and in terms of wealth and resources, the poor South was set against the rich North. Meanwhile, political power moved out of the hands of acknowledged leaders of the various nations and began to reside with the large international companies upon whose products the world increasingly depended. During the 1970s AD, the managing director of just such a multinational firm found himself in an extremely powerful position. His name was Tobias Vaughan.